The secret will that my stepmother tried to burn before it reached my lawyer. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. The smell of burning parchment in my dead father's study is a scent I will never forget. It was an acrid, chemical smoke that clung to the heavy oak panels of the room, a scent that instantly made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My father, a man whose towering presence could fill a stadium, had passed away suddenly from a massive heart attack just 3 days prior. The house was still thick with the oppressive silence of fresh grief, the kind of quiet that rings in your ears and makes every footstep sound like a thunderclap. I had come downstairs late at night to fetch a glass of water when I noticed the faint orange glow flickering under the study door. It was the middle of May in a warm suburb. There was absolutely no logical reason for a fire to be lit in the hearth. When I pushed the heavy wooden door open, the sight before me made my blood run cold. There was my stepmother, Victoria, bathed in the dancing firelight. She was 52, always impeccably dressed, and possessed a polished exterior that successfully hid a deeply calculating nature. Right then, however, her usually flawless composure was entirely shattered. She was frantically jabbing at the flames with a heavy iron poker, desperately trying to reduce a thick stack of watermarked legal documents to ash. "Victoria?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly as I stepped into the room. "What on earth are you doing?" She jumped, dropping the heavy poker onto the brick hearth with a loud, ringing clatter. Her eyes darted wildly toward me, wide with the unmistakable panic of a thief caught with their hand in the register. She quickly adjusted her silk robe, her chest heaving as she forced a tight, completely artificial smile onto her face. "Clara, darling," she said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweetness that completely contradicted the frantic, nervous energy burning in her eyes. "I was just clearing out some of your father's old, irrelevant drafts. You know how cluttered he kept this desk. It's just part of my grieving process, getting rid of the old." I looked from her fake, trembling smile to the raging fire in the hearth. The stakes were astronomical. This sprawling estate, my childhood home, my father's entire life legacy, it was all hanging in the balance right in front of me. I watched the orange flames consume the paper that could have saved my entire future. 7 years ago, my father made the single biggest mistake of his life. He married Victoria. At the time, I was 21 and just starting my own life, eager to see him happy after years of being a lonely widower. Victoria was polished, sophisticated, and possessed a quiet charm that completely blinded him to her underlying, relentless greed. She didn't come into our family alone, either. She brought along her son, Chase, who was 19 at the time and already acting like he had personally earned my father's self-made fortune. The family dynamic shifted almost immediately. The subtle alienation began with small things: family dinners where Victoria would smoothly talk over me, or holidays where Chase would casually demand the keys to my father's vintage cars. Dad was a loving man, but he hated conflict, often turning a blind eye to Victoria's passive-aggressive maneuvers to keep the peace. As the years went by, I moved out and built my own modest, independent life, feeling increasingly like an unwelcome guest whenever I visited my own childhood home. How well do we really know the people sleeping in our parents' beds? It was a question that haunted me during my father's final days. 2 weeks before his sudden heart attack, Dad's demeanor had shifted drastically. He seemed anxious, constantly looking over his shoulder, and he started calling me just to hear my voice. The last time I saw him alive was in the hospital, hooked up to a terrifying array of monitors. Victoria had conveniently stepped out to take a phone call. Dad pulled me close, his breathing ragged and shallow. His eyes held a mixture of deep sorrow and sudden, fierce determination. "Clara," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. "I've been blind. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. But I fixed it. I made it right." I had no idea what he was talking about at the time. I just stroked his forehead, telling him to save his strength and that everything would be okay. He squeezed my hand weakly, but I never got the chance to ask what he meant. The initial reading of the will took place in the sterile, overly air-conditioned office of my father's longtime corporate attorney. The room smelled of stale coffee and expensive leather, and the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. I sat on one side of the mahogany conference table, my hands tightly clasped in my lap. Victoria sat directly across from me, flanked by her arrogant son, Chase. She wore a tailored black dress and a veil of manufactured sorrow that didn't reach her calculating eyes. The attorney cleared his throat and slid a manila folder across the table. We are here to review the last will and testament of Richard Ellis, dated August 14, 2019. My heart sank. 2019. That was just months after he had married Victoria, during the height of his honeymoon phase, when he believed she could do no wrong. As the lawyer droned on, reading the thick legalese, my worst nightmares were realized. The document systematically dismantled my entire future. The family estate, the investment portfolios, the massive life insurance payouts. Everything was left entirely to Victoria. Chase was even named as a secondary beneficiary. My name was mentioned exactly once, in a brief clause leaving me a token sum of $10,000. That can't be right, I interrupted, my voice cracking under the weight of the betrayal. My father and I spoke just days before he died. He explicitly told me he had fixed things. Victoria let out a soft, condescending sigh. Oh, Clara, grief makes us imagine all sorts of things. Your father was very medicated at the end. We must respect his true, legal wishes. Chase leaned back in his chair, a sickening smirk playing on his lips as he casually checked the diamond watch on his wrist, a watch that had belonged to my father. Look on the bright side, Clara. 10 grand is a lot of money for someone with your lifestyle. You should be grateful. The sheer audacity of their greed left me completely paralyzed. They were stealing my father's entire legacy right in front of my eyes, and the law was apparently on their side. Victoria offered me a hollow smile as she officially erased my father's only biological child. I couldn't stop thinking about the fireplace incident. The image of Victoria frantically destroying those documents played on a continuous, maddening loop in my mind. After the devastating will reading, I knew I had to go back to the estate. I needed to know exactly what she had been trying to hide that night. I returned to the house under the guise of packing up a few of my father's personal photo albums. Victoria was out meeting with an estate liquidator, already eagerly cataloging her newly acquired wealth. I slipped quietly into my father's oak-paneled study and locked the heavy door behind me. The fireplace was cold now, completely devoid of the orange flames that had haunted my memories. I dropped to my knees on the brick hearth, ignoring the expensive slacks I was wearing, and plunged my bare hands directly into the pile of gray soot and ash. It was a desperate, pathetic sight. I was literally sifting through the charred remains of my family's history, praying for a miracle. The ash coated my hands and stained my cuffs, filling the air with that familiar, acrid scent of burnt paper. For 10 agonizing minutes, I found nothing but crumbling, unrecognizable flakes of carbon. My hope began to rapidly fade, replaced by a deep, suffocating despair. Maybe I was crazy. Maybe she really had just been burning old, irrelevant drafts like she claimed. Then, my fingers hit something solid. It was wedged deep in the back corner of the grate, completely buried beneath a thick layer of soot. My breath hitched in my throat as I carefully pulled the object out. It was a triangular fragment of thick, high-quality ivory paper, the kind used exclusively for official legal documents. The edges were heavily scorched and blackened, but the center remained perfectly intact. I gently brushed away the worst of the ash with my thumb, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs as text began to reveal itself. My fingers brushed against a thick, unburned corner of parchment hidden beneath the heavy soot. I didn't dare examine the fragment inside the house. I wrapped the charred parchment carefully in a silk handkerchief, slipped it into my purse, and immediately drove to a quiet, run-down diner on the edge of town. I slid into a sticky vinyl booth in the very back and waited. 20 minutes later, the bell above the door jingled, and my Uncle Ray walked in. Ray was my father's older brother, a gruff, no-nonsense man who had always deeply distrusted Victoria and her shiny, superficial charm. You sounded terrified on the phone, Clara, Ray said, sliding into the booth across from me. He ordered 2 black coffees without looking at the menu. Tell me exactly what's going on. I didn't say a word. I just pulled the soot-stained handkerchief from my purse and carefully unfolded it on the formica table. Ray's bushy eyebrows shot up as he leaned in to examine the salvaged fragment. We used a paper napkin to gently wipe away the remaining layer of gray ash. The words printed on the thick ivory paper were unmistakably clear. It was the bottom right corner of a signature page. Above a jagged, burnt edge, we could clearly read the words. He run to set my hand and seal. This 14th day of April. April 14th, Ray muttered, his voice thick with disbelief. Clara, that was barely 3 weeks before he died. He wrote a new will. But that wasn't the most important part. Right below the date was a partially intact, royal blue notary stamp. The fire had eaten away the top half of the circle, but the bottom half clearly displayed a name and title. Na Hughes, Notary Public, State of. The rest was gone, swallowed by the flames. Victoria knew. I whispered, the horrifying reality finally sinking in. She knew he changed it, and she intentionally burned the only copy. Uncle Ray's weathered face hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He slammed his fist down onto the diner table, causing our coffee cups to rattle loudly against their saucers. Ray looked up at me with pale realization as we understood a newer will definitely existed. The very next morning, the situation violently escalated. I drove up to the estate to continue my search for clues, only to find my key wouldn't turn in the heavy front door. I jiggled the lock, confused, until I noticed the shiny new deadbolt installed above the brass handle. Before I could even knock, the door swung open. Chase stood in the entryway, holding a cup of my father's expensive espresso. He looked incredibly smug, wearing a designer tracksuit that he undoubtedly purchased using Dad's money. Locksmith came early, Chase said lazily, taking a slow sip of his coffee. Mom figured you'd try sneaking back in to steal some of Richard's valuables. The estate is officially ours now, Clara. You have absolutely no legal right to be on this property. This is my family home, Chase. I fired back, my hands curling into tight fists at my sides. You and your mother are committing fraud, and you know it. Let me inside right now. Chase just laughed, a cruel, dismissive sound that echoed off the vaulted ceiling of the foyer. Fraud. That's a big word for a girl who just got disinherited. Probate opens on Friday, sweetheart. Once the judge stamps that 2019 will, everything is locked in permanently. You're entirely out of time. He slammed the heavy oak door directly in my face. The metallic click of the new deadbolt sliding into place sounded incredibly final. I stood on the porch, trembling with a mixture of profound grief and absolute, white-hot rage. He was right about one thing. The clock was ticking down fast. Victoria was aggressively pushing the fake will through the courts, trying to finalize the legal transfer before anyone could mount a proper challenge. I walked back to my car, my mind racing as I frantically calculated my next steps. If I didn't find the real will before probate closed, the house would be theirs forever. I was completely locked out of the estate, but Victoria had foolishly underestimated my digital access. Back in my tiny apartment, I pulled out an old laptop that still had my father's shared cloud calendar synced to the desktop. Dad wasn't particularly tech-savvy, so he relied heavily on this digital calendar to keep his busy life organized. If he had executed a new will on April 14th, there had to be a corresponding appointment. I scrolled back through the weeks, my eyes scanning the mundane entries of golf games and board meetings. Then I saw it. On the afternoon of April 14th, there was a vague, 2-hour block simply titled, Meeting, Private Vault. My heart skipped a beat. Dad didn't keep his most sensitive documents at his corporate office. He kept them in a private safety deposit box. But where was the key? I frantically searched through my own memories. Whenever my father traveled, he used to give me a backup keychain with spares for his car and office, just in case of an emergency. I tore through my apartment, emptying old shoeboxes and digging through the back of my desk drawers. Finally, inside a dusty ceramic bowl on my bookshelf, I found the heavy metal keychain. Most of the keys were familiar, but one stood out. It was a small, elongated brass key with a geometric head. It had no branding, just a very specific string of numbers delicately engraved along the shaft. I immediately pulled out my phone and started searching for private bank vaults in the financial district. I cross-referenced the unique shape of the key with images online. After an hour of intense, agonizing digging, I finally found a perfect match. The tiny serial number stamped on the brass key matched a private bank located downtown. The private bank was an imposing marble building that smelled of old money and extreme discretion. I presented the brass key and my own identification, praying that my father had listed me as an authorized user on the vault. The teller checked her computer, her face remaining entirely neutral. Yes, Ms. Ellis. You are an authorized secondary on box 402. Right this way. I was escorted into a sterile, windowless room. The teller placed a long metal box on the table and left me alone. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I lifted the lid. I fully expected to find the original copy of the new will sitting right on top. Instead, the box was completely devoid of legal documents. There was no will, but there was a thick stack of bank statements printed on heavy paper, neatly bound with a rubber band. I pulled them out, my brow furrowing in confusion. These were statements for my father's primary liquid asset accounts, dated during the exact 2 weeks he was lying in a medically induced coma in the ICU. As I scanned the lines of data, a wave of pure nausea washed over me. This wasn't just about a stolen inheritance anymore. Line after line showed massive, unauthorized wire transfers draining the accounts. $50,000 here, $100,000 there. The destination account was an LLC completely registered under Chase's name. In total, over $450,000 had been systematically siphoned out in a matter of days. The mini twist hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Victoria wasn't just burning the will to secure the house. She was actively destroying evidence of a massive financial crime. Victoria had drained my father's liquid assets while he was lying helpless in the ICU. The wire transfers were a massive discovery, but without the new will, Victoria would still ultimately inherit the entire estate and easily cover her tracks. I had to focus on the burnt fragment. I went back to my laptop and searched the city registry for the partial name on the blue stamp. Not Hughes, Notary Public. It took dozens of phone calls, but I finally located an independent mobile notary named Anna Hughes who operated out of a small office across town. I drove straight there, clutching the charred fragment in my purse. Anna was a sharp-eyed woman in her late 40s. When I showed her a photo of my father and asked about April 14th, her eyes widened in immediate recognition. Richard Ellis, she said softly, nodding her head. Yes, I remember him clearly. A very kind man. He tipped me incredibly well that day. Did he sign a last will and testament? I pressed, leaning forward over her desk, my heart hammering in my chest. He did, Anna confirmed, pulling a thick leather logbook from her drawer. I notarized a complete revocation of all prior wills and a brand new estate document. He was very adamant that his daughter, Clara, was to be the sole executor and primary beneficiary. He said he was finally making things right. Do you have a copy? I begged, tears of absolute relief springing to my eyes. Anna shook her head apologetically. I'm sorry, honey. I just stamped the signatures. I don't retain the actual documents. But I do remember the attorney who drafted it and took possession of the official digital copies. She reached into her drawer and pulled out a sleek, minimalist business card. She gave me the business card of the man holding the key to my legacy. I was practically floating as I walked out of Anna's office, the business card of Attorney Vance clutched tightly in my hand. For the first time since my father's death, I felt like I actually had a fighting chance. But my momentary triumph was violently cut short the second I reached my car. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an unknown number, but the voice on the other end was sickeningly familiar. You are asking far too many questions, Clara, Victoria said smoothly, her tone stripped of its usual fake warmth. I don't know what you're talking about. I lied, my stomach plummeting as I realized she must have been monitoring my father's accounts and saw my vault access. Don't play dumb with me, you little brat, she hissed, the venom finally pouring out. You think you can play detective? You're out of your league. I am going to offer you a choice. I will graciously wire $50,000 to your pathetic bank account by the end of the day. You take the money, you sign a non-disclosure agreement, and you walk away from this estate forever. And if I refuse? I asked, my grip tightening on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned completely white. If you refuse, she replied calmly, I will have my lawyers file a permanent restraining order against you for harassing a grieving widow. I will drag you through civil court until you are entirely bankrupt, and you will never see a single dime of Richard's money. The sheer audacity of her threat left me temporarily speechless. She was trying to buy me off with a tiny fraction of my own father's stolen wealth. Her voice was ice cold, proving just how desperate she was to keep it buried. I didn't take Victoria's insulting bribe. Instead, I drove straight to the towering glass office building of Attorney Vance. He was a man in his late 50s, sharp, methodical, and radiating a calm authority that instantly put me at ease. I laid everything out on his massive mahogany desk. The burnt fragment, the bank statements showing the fraudulent wire transfers, and the sworn statement I had just acquired from the notary. Vance examined the evidence carefully, his face entirely unreadable. Then, he opened a secure file on his computer and turned the monitor toward me. Your father came to me specifically because he suspected Victoria was isolating him and tampering with his accounts, Vance explained. I drafted the new will. I hold the master digital copy, and I also have a sealed, time-stamped video testimony of your father explicitly stating his true intentions. I gasped, tears finally spilling over my cheeks. Then we have her. We can stop the probate. We can, Vance agreed, leaning back in his leather chair. But presenting this now will trigger a massive, drawn-out legal battle. Victoria will claim the new will is a forgery, or that your father lacked mental capacity. She has the stolen funds to tie us up in litigation for years. So what do we do? I asked, wiping my eyes. We don't just fight her, Vance said, a dangerous glint appearing in his steely eyes. We destroy her credibility entirely. To ensure a swift victory and immediate criminal charges, we need to catch her committing undeniable, documented perjury on the official record. We needed to lure Victoria into a sworn deposition so she could dig her grave. The trap was elegantly simple, yet incredibly dangerous. Under Vance's strict guidance, I called Victoria and told her I was officially broken. I feigned exhaustion and told her I would accept a modest financial settlement to walk away entirely, provided we signed the paperwork in a neutral mediation setting. Victoria, blinded by her own greed and arrogance, eagerly agreed. We met 2 days later in a sterile, glass-walled mediation room downtown. Victoria arrived wearing designer sunglasses and a triumphant smirk, accompanied by Chase, who looked incredibly bored by the entire proceeding. Attorney Vance sat at the head of the long table, playing the role of the neutral mediator perfectly. Before we finalize this settlement, Vance said smoothly, sliding a crisp, formal document across the table toward Victoria. The court requires a sworn, notarized affidavit confirming that the 2019 will you submitted to probate is, to your absolute knowledge, the final and only last will and testament of Richard Ellis. Victoria didn't even hesitate. She didn't bother to read the fine print. She just pulled a gold pen from her expensive purse and aggressively signed her name on the dotted line. The notary sitting in the corner officially stamped the document, sealing the legal trap shut. There, Victoria said, sliding the paper back with a deeply condescending smile. Now, Clara, take your little check and disappear from our lives. I just sat there, my heart pounding in my ears, staring directly into her cold eyes. The moment the ink dried on her perjury, Vance calmly reached into his leather briefcase. The atmosphere in the mediation room shifted so violently it felt like the air pressure had suddenly dropped. Vance didn't pull out a settlement check. Instead, he pulled out a clear, plastic evidence bag. Inside the bag rested the heavily scorched, triangular fragment of thick ivory parchment. He placed it gently in the exact center of the table. Victoria's triumphant smile instantly froze, her eyes locking onto the burnt paper like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming truck. What is this? Chase demanded, leaning forward aggressively. This, Vance said, his voice ringing with absolute, chilling authority, is the salvaged signature page of a newer will executed by Richard Ellis on April 14th. A document that someone maliciously attempted to destroy in a fireplace. Before Victoria could even stammer out a defense, Vance grabbed a remote control and turned on the large television mounted on the wall. The screen flickered to life, showing my father sitting in Vance's office, looking incredibly tired but entirely lucid. Richard Ellis, my father's recorded voice boomed through the quiet room. Being of sound mind, do hereby revoke all prior wills. I leave my entire estate to my only daughter, Clara. My wife, Victoria, has systematically attempted to isolate me and steal my assets, and is to receive absolutely nothing. The color completely drained from Victoria's face, leaving her looking sickly and pale. Chase jumped out of his chair, sputtering incoherent denials as the reality of their situation crashed down. Her polished facade completely dissolved into a screaming fit of absolute panic inside the boardroom. The legal hammer didn't just drop, it absolutely obliterated Victoria's entire world. Because she had signed the sworn affidavit under penalty of perjury, her attempt to contest the new will was instantly thrown out of court by a furious judge. But the lost inheritance was the least of her immediate problems. Attorney Vance had already compiled a massive dossier containing the bank statements and the undeniable proof of the unauthorized wire transfers. The moment the mediation ended, he handed the entire file over to the district attorney's office. Felony wire fraud, especially against a vulnerable, dying spouse, carried mandatory prison time. 2 weeks later, I watched from the street as police cruisers pulled up to the estate. Victoria was escorted out the front door in handcuffs, her designer clothes looking entirely pathetic under the flashing red and blue lights. Chase's fraudulent LLC was immediately frozen by federal authorities, and he was formally evicted from the premises by the county sheriff. They lost absolutely everything in their greedy pursuit of more. A month later, the estate was officially settled according to my father's true wishes. I drove up the long, winding driveway of my childhood home, no longer an unwelcome guest, but the rightful owner. I walked up the stone steps and slid my own key into the heavy brass lock. The deadbolt clicked open with a deeply satisfying sound. Stepping through those heavy oak doors, I finally felt the oppressive shadow lift from us. It has been 6 months since I officially reclaimed my father's legacy, and the house finally feels like home again. I spent the first few weeks thoroughly airing out the study, scrubbing the heavy fireplace until the acrid smell of burnt parchment was nothing but a distant memory. The estate is now secure, and I've established a charitable foundation in my father's name, ensuring that his incredible hard work will genuinely benefit those who truly need it, rather than lining the pockets of greedy manipulators. This entire nightmare taught me incredibly hard lessons about grief, trust, and the dark realities of human nature. How well do we really know the people sleeping in our parents' beds? It's a terrifying question, but one that absolutely must be asked. If you are navigating a toxic family estate, my biggest piece of advice is to meticulously document everything. Do not blindly trust polite smiles, and never ignore the sudden red flags. Encourage your parents to secure their legacy digitally, with independent attorneys who will fiercely protect their final wishes. We often think that honoring our deceased loved ones means silently keeping the peace at all costs. But sometimes, true love requires going to war to protect what they built. It was a terrifying, exhausting battle that tested my entire spirit, but looking around this beautiful house today, I know I won. I fought for my father's true legacy, and I would do it all over again.